There's a question very few people ever ask themselves. Not because they're incapable of thinking it, but because the answer might unravel everything they've built their emotional lives upon. What if the people you've loved weren't accidents? What if the ones who broke you, the ones who left, the ones who stayed but never truly saw you, what if they were never random at all? What if every single person who ever held your heart was actually summoned there by something deep inside you? Something ancient, something that knew exactly what you needed to see, even when your conscious mind was busy calling it love. Carl Jung spent decades mapping the territory most of us spend our entire lives trying to escape. And what he found beneath the surface of our romantic choices is both unsettling and liberating. He discovered that love isn't just an emotion, it's a reveal. It's not just a connection, it's a confrontation. And the person you find yourself obsessed with, unable to leave, unable to forget, that person is rarely who you think they are. They're a symbol. They're a messenger. They're a part of your own psyche, wearing the face of another human being, sent to show you exactly where you're still hiding from yourself. 1. Psychological setup. Think about the last time someone truly got under your skin. Not the casual annoyance of a stranger, but the deep, visceral agitation that comes from someone you love, or once loved. The way their absence felt like an ache in your bones. The way their silence screamed louder than any argument. The way you replayed conversations in your head, searching for the moment things shifted, searching for what you could have done differently. Now consider something that might be difficult to accept. That person, in all their power over you, was not the source of your pain. They were the catalyst. They walked into your life and touched something that was already there, something that had been waiting, sometimes for decades, to be activated. And because it's easier to focus on the other person, easier to blame them, analyze them, obsess over them, you never stop to ask the question that could actually set you free. What was that person reflecting back at me? Jung observed that human beings don't just fall in love randomly. We fall into patterns. And those patterns are not determined by the stars, or by luck, or by some cosmic lottery. They're determined by the parts of ourselves we've refused to look at, the parts we've buried so deep that we no longer recognize them as our own. So they appear before us in the flesh, in the form of another person. And we call it chemistry. We call it destiny. We call it love. But what if it's something else entirely? Imagine your psyche as a vast landscape. Most people live only in the small, well-lit village of their conscious mind. They know their name, their job, their preferences, their opinions. They think this is who they are. But beyond that village lies an entire wilderness, a dark forest of memories, instincts, fears, and desires that never fully integrated. Jung called this the shadow. And here's what most people never realize. The shadow doesn't just sit there in the darkness, passive and silent. It reaches out. It projects. It finds people in the external world who can carry its weight, who can act out its dramas, who can show the conscious mind what it refuses to see. And that's where the people you love come in. 2. The hidden pattern. There's a reason you keep encountering the same dynamic in different bodies. The partner who pulls away just when you get close. The lover who gives just enough to keep you hooked, but never enough to make you feel secure. The one who seems perfect on paper but leaves you feeling empty in practice. The names change, the faces change, the cities change, but the feeling remains the same, a haunting familiarity, like a song you've heard before but can't quite name. This isn't bad luck. This isn't a curse. This is your unconscious mind orchestrating a repetition until you're ready to learn what it's trying to teach you. Let's take a deeper look at how this actually works. Imagine a child who grows up in an environment where love is conditional. Maybe affection only came when they performed well, achieved something, made themselves small or large depending on what the adults needed. That child learns, not through words but through bone-deep experience, that love is something to be earned, that worth is something to be proven, that connection requires constant vigilance. Fast forward 20 years. That child, now an adult, enters a romantic relationship. They meet someone who loves them steadily, consistently, without conditions. And something feels wrong. It feels uncomfortable. It feels almost suffocating. Because their nervous system, their emotional blueprint, was built in a world where love was unpredictable. So what do? They sabotage it. They create drama. They push the stable person away and find themselves inexplicably drawn to someone unpredictable. Someone who keeps them guessing. Someone who recreates the emotional weather of their childhood. And they'll call it chemistry. They'll say the spark was missing in the stable relationship. They'll say the new person just understands them better. But what's really happening is much deeper and much more painful. They're not choosing love. They're choosing familiarity. They're choosing the emotional temperature they learned to call home, even if that home was cold. Jung understood something that modern dating culture has completely forgotten. We don't attract what we want. We attract what we are. And until you understand what you are, until you've mapped your own shadow, until you've sat with the parts of yourself that you've disowned, you'll keep attracting the same lessons in different bodies. Think about the people who have triggered you the most in relationships. The ones who made you feel small, jealous, insecure, desperate. What if those people weren't villains? What if they were mirrors so accurate that you couldn't bear to look? What if every criticism that cut you to the bone landed exactly where you already doubted yourself? What if every fear they activated was a fear you've been carrying since long before they arrived? This is not about blaming yourself for the ways others have hurt you. That's not the point at all. The point is something far more empowering. If the problem was always outside you, if it was always their fault, their issues, their unavailability, their narcissism, their avoidance, then you're permanently stuck. Because you can't control them. You can't fix them. You can't make them see. You can only wait, hope, and get hurt again. But if you're willing to consider that these people were messengers, that they were showing you something about yourself, then suddenly the power shifts. You're no longer a victim of your romantic history. You're a student of it. And every relationship, especially the painful ones, becomes data, becomes revelation, becomes a roadmap back to yourself. 3. The deeper psychology. Let's go deeper into the mechanism behind all of this. Jung introduced a concept that explains why we fall for certain people with such force that it feels like we have no choice. He called it projection. And projection is not just seeing what you want to see in someone. It's far more automatic and far more deceptive. Projection happens when you have a quality within yourself, a potential, a desire, a fear that you haven't acknowledged. Instead of recognizing it as your own, you unconsciously attribute it to someone else. You see in them what you can't yet see in yourself. And because that quality is actually alive in you, even if buried, your attraction to them feels electric. It feels fated. It feels like they hold the key to something you've been searching for. But here's the painful truth they never tell you in romantic movies. That intensity you feel, that sense that this person is your other half, your missing piece, your soulmate, that intensity is often a sign that you're projecting. You're not seeing them. You're seeing a part of yourself that you've exiled. And because that part is charged with all the energy of the unconscious, the attraction is overwhelming. Think about the kind of person you're most drawn to. Not the one you think you should want, but the one who actually makes your heart race, who keeps you up at night, who you can't stop thinking about even when you know they're wrong for you. What quality do they have that you secretly wish you had? Is it their freedom, their confidence, their emotional detachment, their ability to walk away? Now ask yourself the uncomfortable question. What if that quality isn't something they possess, and you lack? What if it's something you possess but have never allowed yourself to express? What if their freedom triggers you because you've kept yourself locked in cages of obligation? What if their confidence stings because you've spent your life making yourself small? What if their emotional detachment feels magnetic because you're drowning in your own unexpressed feelings and can't imagine surviving without them? Jung described the anima and animus as inner figures that carry the qualities we've been taught to repress. Men often project their anima, their inner feminine, onto women, seeking someone to carry their emotional lives for them. Women often project their animus, their inner masculine, onto men, seeking someone to embody the strength and agency they've been discouraged from owning. But these are just the most basic layers. Beneath them lies an entire constellation of disowned parts: the rebel, the healer, the child, the sage, the shadow. And every person who enters your life with romantic intensity is carrying one of these projections. They're standing in for a part of you that's waiting to be reclaimed. This is why heartbreak is so devastating, and also why it can be so transformative. When the person leaves, when they fail you, when they reveal themselves to be just a flawed human being instead of the god or goddess you projected onto them, you're not just losing them. You're losing the part of yourself you'd invested in them. And that loss feels like dying, because a part of you really did die, the part that was living vicariously through another person instead of being lived directly. But here's what most people never realize until they've done the work. On the other side of that death is resurrection. When you stop projecting, when you reclaim the qualities you'd given away, you become whole in a way you've never been before. You no longer need someone to carry your confidence because you've found your own. You no longer need someone to rescue you because you've learned to rescue yourself. You no longer need someone to complete you because you've discovered you were never actually broken. 4. The turning point. There comes a moment in every person's emotional evolution when the old story stops working, when the patterns become so obvious, so repetitive, so exhausting, that you can no longer pretend they're accidents. This moment usually arrives in the form of a crisis. A relationship ends that you were sure would last. Someone leaves who you were certain would stay. Or worse, someone stays but becomes a stranger, and you realize you've been alone for years while sharing a bed. In that moment, you have a choice. You can do what you've always done. Blame, analyze, obsess, fall into the story of what they did and didn't do. Or you can turn inward and ask the question that could actually change everything. What is this pattern trying to show me? Not what is wrong with them. Not what they should have done differently. Not how they failed you. But what is this pattern, this repetition that keeps playing out in different costumes, trying to reveal about the architecture of your own soul? This is the turning point. This is where most people run. Because it's infinitely easier to stay in the story of victimhood. It's easier to collect evidence of how you've been wronged. It's easier to build a case against every person who's ever hurt you than it is to sit alone with yourself and admit that you played a role in your own suffering. Not that you deserve to be hurt. Never that. But that you chose, unconsciously, to stay in dynamics that hurt you. That you ignored red flags because the flags were familiar. That you gave your heart to people who couldn't hold it, because on some level you didn't believe your heart deserved to be held. This is not comfortable to hear. It's not meant to be. It's meant to wake you up. Jung said that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. And in love, this is where most people live. They call it fate that they keep falling for unavailable people. They call it bad luck that every relationship ends the same way. They call it a curse that they can't find someone who truly loves them. But it's not fate. It's not luck. It's not a curse. It's the unconscious, running the show, while the conscious mind sits in the audience, believing it's just watching a movie it didn't write. The turning point comes when you realize you are the writer. You always have been. You just forgot. You handed the pen to your wounds, to your childhood, to your fears, and let them write the script. But the pen is still in your hand. You can pick it up at any moment. You can rewrite the entire story. Not by finding a different kind of person, but by becoming a different kind of person. Not by searching for someone who will love you correctly, but by learning to love yourself so completely that incorrect love becomes immediately obvious and immediately unacceptable. 5. The integration. So what does it actually look like when someone begins to integrate these truths? What changes in the way they love and the way they're loved? First, they stop confusing intensity with intimacy. They understand now that the fire of early attraction, the obsession, the inability to think about anything else, the feeling that this person is everything. They understand that this is often a sign of projection, not connection. They don't run from chemistry, but they no longer worship it. They know that real love doesn't always feel like a fever. Sometimes it feels like peace. Sometimes it feels like coming home to a house you've always lived in but never appreciated. Second, they stop needing to be needed. This is a massive shift. Most relationships are built on a silent contract. I'll make you feel valuable if you make me feel secure. I'll fill your emptiness if you fill mine. But two empty people cannot fill each other. They can only take turns bleeding on one another. When you've done the inner work, when you've sat with your own darkness and made peace with your own company, you no longer approach love from lack. You approach it from fullness. You don't need someone to complete you. You want someone to share the completion you've already found within yourself. And that changes everything. Third, they develop what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to hold opposites without splitting. They can love someone and still see their flaws. They can commit without losing themselves. They can be hurt without becoming bitter. They can leave without destroying. They can stay without settling. This is emotional maturity. And it's rare, not because it's difficult to understand, but because it requires facing the parts of yourself that you'd rather ignore. It requires admitting that you have a shadow, that you are capable of jealousy, manipulation, neediness, and control, that you've hurt people too, that you've been the unavailable one, the confusing one, the one who couldn't love correctly. When you integrate your shadow, you stop projecting it onto others. You stop seeing villains everywhere because you've made peace with the villain within. You stop needing your partners to be perfect because you've accepted your own imperfection. You stop demanding that love be a fairy tale because you've learned that real love is grittier, messier, and far more beautiful than any fairy tale. And here's what happens next. The kind of love you attract begins to shift. Not because the universe rearranges itself around you, but because you no longer resonate with the old patterns. When someone emotionally unavailable appears, they don't look mysterious and intriguing anymore. They look like what they are, a person who can't show up. And that's no longer attractive to you. When someone tries to love you in the old ways, with inconsistency, with games, with breadcrumbs, it doesn't feel like chemistry. It feels like what it is. A reminder of who you used to be. And you walk away, not with drama, not with a scene, but with quiet certainty. Because you've learned that you don't have to fight for love. You only have to recognize it. And if it requires fighting, it's not love. It's a war you've been trained to call love. This is the integration. This is what happens when the unconscious becomes conscious. The patterns lose their power. The repetitions stop. The same old story finally ends because you've learned what it came to teach you. 6. The deeper layers of shadow and desire. Let's go even deeper into territory that most discussions about love never touch. Because the shadow isn't just made up of the qualities we consider negative. It also contains our unlived life, our untapped potential, the person we could have become if we hadn't been taught to shrink. Think about the people who fascinate you most. The ones who seem to live with a freedom you envy. The ones who take risks you'd never take. The ones who express anger you've swallowed, desire you've suppressed, creativity you've abandoned. You might tell yourself you're just admiring them, but Jung would ask a different question. What part of yourself are you watching them live out so you don't have to? This is one of the most painful shadows to face, because it means admitting that you've outsourced your own potential, that you've been living vicariously through lovers who embody the courage, the spontaneity, the wildness, that you've locked away inside yourself. And when they leave, when they fail, when they reveal themselves to be just as human as you are, you're not just losing them. You're losing the only connection you had to your own unlived life. There's a reason you're drawn to artists if you've buried your creativity. There's a reason you're drawn to rebels if you've spent your life people-pleasing. There's a reason you're drawn to emotionally explosive people if you've never learned to express your own anger. They're not just lovers, they're avatars. They're living out the parts of your soul that you've deemed unacceptable. And the tragedy is that as long as you keep projecting, you'll never reclaim those parts. You'll keep searching for someone to be your freedom, your passion, your voice, while you remain small, safe, and slowly dying inside. This is why some of the most intense attractions eventually turn to resentment. Because the person you projected onto can never fully deliver what you're asking them to carry. They can't be your courage. They can only remind you that you're afraid. They can't be your passion. They can only highlight your numbness. And eventually, you'll blame them for the very thing you asked them to do, carry the weight of your unlived life. The only way out of this is to reclaim your projections, to stop looking for someone to be your missing pieces and start becoming whole yourself. To write that book you've been talking about for years, to take that risk you've been afraid to take, to express that anger you've been swallowing, to live the life you've been watching others live. And when you do, something remarkable happens. The magnetic pull toward people who represent your unlived life begins to fade, not because they're less attractive, but because you're no longer missing what they represent. You have it now. It's yours, and you can finally see them for who they really are, not as symbols of your own potential, but as human beings with their own shadows, their own unlived lives, their own projections. This is freedom. This is what Jung meant by individuation, becoming so fully yourself that you no longer need anyone else to carry your soul. And from that place, love becomes something entirely different. It's no longer a search. It's no longer a desperate grab for completion. It's a meeting, two whole people choosing to walk together, not because they need each other, but because they want to, because the path is richer, stranger, and more beautiful when shared. 7. The paradox of solitude and connection. There's a paradox at the heart of all this that most people never understand. The capacity to be truly alone determines the capacity to be truly loved. Think about that for a moment. If you cannot tolerate your own company, if silence feels like suffocation, if being alone triggers anxiety, desperation, or a frantic need to connect, then every relationship you enter will be contaminated by that fear. You won't be choosing partners. You'll be fleeing from yourself. And any love built on fleeing is not love at all. It's a hostage situation. Jung spent years in solitude, particularly after his break with Freud, descending into his own unconscious, facing his own demons, mapping his own inner world. He didn't do this because he was antisocial or because he didn't value connection. He did it because he understood that you cannot meet another soul until you've met your own. You cannot see another person clearly until you've seen yourself. You cannot love another freely until you've learned to love the one person you can never escape, yourself. Most people are terrified of this kind of solitude. They fill every moment with noise, with distraction, with other people. They move from relationship to relationship with barely a breath in between. And they wonder why each new love feels like the same old story. Because they haven't changed. They've just found a new actor to play the same role in the same script. The person who has sat with their own darkness, who has faced their own emptiness without flinching, who has learned to be alone without being lonely, that person enters relationships from an entirely different place. They don't cling. They don't grasp. They don't beg. They don't manipulate. They simply show up, fully present, fully themselves, and they wait to see if the other person can do the same. And here's the beautiful irony. When you're no longer desperate for love, love often finds you more easily. Not because the universe is playing tricks, but because your energy has shifted. You're no longer radiating need. You're radiating wholeness. And wholeness is attractive. Not in the way that desperation masquerading as charm is attractive, but in a deeper way. Wholeness signals safety. It signals that you won't collapse if someone leaves. It signals that you're capable of being with another person without using them as an emotional life support system. This is what it means to love from abundance instead of lack. And it's only possible when you've done the solitary work of becoming yourself. 8. The myth of the perfect partner. Let's address something that keeps people trapped in unhealthy patterns for decades. The myth of the perfect partner. The belief that somewhere out there is a person who will finally get you, finally complete you, finally make everything okay. This myth is seductive because it places salvation outside yourself. It gives you something to search for, something to hope for, something to believe will eventually arrive and fix everything. But it's also a trap, because as long as you're searching for the perfect partner, you'll never become the person capable of sustaining real love. Jung understood that the image of the perfect partner is almost always a projection of the anima, or animus. It's an internal image, not an external reality. And when you project that image onto a real human being, you set them up to fail. No one can be your perfect other half, because no one can live up to an internal fantasy. The real person will always have flaws, always have needs, always have a shadow. And when those flaws appear, when the fantasy shatters, you'll blame them for failing to be what they never actually were. The alternative is terrifying to most people. It means giving up the search for the perfect partner. It means accepting that no one is coming to save you. It means realizing that the love you're looking for, the deep, transformative soul-level love, is not something you find. It's something you build, with a real, flawed, complicated human being, starting from the ground up, with no guarantees. This is why so many people stay in the fantasy, because the fantasy is safe. It doesn't require you to show up, to be vulnerable, to risk real rejection. It only requires you to wait, to hope, to believe that someday, somehow, the right person will appear and make everything make sense. But life doesn't work that way. Love doesn't work that way. And Jung's psychology doesn't work that way. The path is always inward. The treasure is always buried in the field of your own psyche. And the partner, when they come, is not the treasure. They're a fellow digger. Someone willing to get their hands dirty alongside you, uncovering their own buried parts while you uncover yours. That's real love. Not the fairy tale. Not the fantasy. Two people committed to their own individuation, supporting each other's growth, facing each other's shadows, and choosing each other anyway. Not because they're perfect, but because they're real. Not because they complete each other, but because they've each completed themselves enough to have something real to share. 9. The courage to walk away. There's another aspect of this journey that doesn't get talked about enough. Sometimes, integrating your shadow. Sometimes, reclaiming your projections. Sometimes, becoming whole means walking away from people you love. Not because they're bad, not because they've wronged you, but because the dynamic between you is built on projections that no longer hold. Because you've grown in a direction they can't or won't follow. Because staying would mean shrinking back into the person you used to be, and that person no longer exists. This is one of the hardest things a human being can do. To love someone and still leave them. To recognize the beauty in another person, while also recognizing that your paths have diverged. To feel the pull of history, of comfort, of familiarity, and still choose the unknown, because the unknown is where your soul is calling you. Most people can't do this. They stay in relationships long after the growth has stopped, because leaving feels like failure. They stay because they're afraid of hurting the other person. They stay because they're afraid of being alone. They stay because they've invested years, decades, and can't bear to walk away from that investment. But Jung would ask a different question. What are you investing in? Your comfort? Your fear? Your refusal to face your own next step? Because sometimes the most loving thing you can do, for yourself and for the other person, is to walk away. To release them from the projection of being your partner, so they can find their own path. To release yourself from the story so you can write a new one. This doesn't mean leaving becomes your first response to every difficulty. Relationships require work, commitment, the willingness to go through the dark together. But they also require honesty. And sometimes the honest truth is that the relationship has served its purpose. It taught you what you needed to learn. It showed you what you needed to see. And now it's time to move on. The courage to walk away is also the courage to trust that you'll be okay alone. That your worth isn't tied to being in a relationship. That your identity can survive the ending. And that on the other side of the grief, there's a version of you waiting. More whole, more real, more alive than the one who stayed out of fear. 10. The return to self. Let's bring this home now. Because after all the analysis, after all the psychology, after all the deep dives into shadow and projection and unconscious patterns, there's only one question that ultimately matters. Who are you when no one is watching? Not who you are in a relationship. Not who you are when you're being seen, desired, chosen. Not who you are when someone else's attention is reflecting back an image of yourself that you can tolerate. But who are you in the silence? Who are you when the phone doesn't ring? Who are you when there's no one to perform for? No one to impress? No one to convince that you're worthy of love? This is the return to self. This is what Jung spent his life exploring. The slow, painstaking, often lonely process of peeling away the layers of persona, the masks we wear for the world, until what remains is simply what is. Not what you wish you were, not what you pretend to be, not what others need you to be, but what you actually are, in your essence, before any relationship, before any wound, before any story. And here's what most people discover when they make this return. They discover that they were never actually broken. They discover that the hole they'd been trying to fill with love was never a hole at all. It was a doorway. It was a passage into a deeper part of themselves that they'd been afraid to enter. And on the other side of that doorway, there's no lack. There's no emptiness. There's no desperate need to be completed. There's just presence, just awareness, just the quiet, unshakable knowledge that you are enough, not because you've finally found someone who confirms it, but because you've finally stopped looking outside for confirmation. This is the end of the search, not because you've found the perfect partner, but because you've found yourself. And from this place, love becomes optional in the best possible way. You don't need it to survive. You don't need it to feel whole. You don't need it to prove your worth. You simply want it, or not, depending on what life brings. And because you don't need it, you can actually receive it. Without clutching, without controlling, without the constant fear of loss that poisons most relationships. The person who has returned to themselves loves differently. They love with open hands instead of clenched fists. They love without demanding that the other person be their salvation. They love without the constant subtext of "don't leave me or I'll die." They love from wholeness, not from wound. And that kind of love, that rare, conscious, awake kind of love, has a quality that most people have never experienced. It's peaceful without being boring. It's deep without being heavy. It's committed without being trapped. 11. The final reflection. We've traveled far in this exploration, from the hidden patterns of attraction to the depths of the shadow, from the painful revelations of projection to the liberating truth of integration. And if there's one thing to carry with you from all of this, let it be this. The love you attract has never been about luck. It's never been about fate. It's never been about finding the right person at the right time. It's always been about you, about who you are when no one is looking, about what you believe you deserve, about the parts of yourself you've hidden, projected, and denied, about your willingness to look inward, to face the darkness, to reclaim what you've given away. Every person who has ever loved you, who has ever hurt you, who has ever left you or stayed, has been a messenger. They've been carrying a letter from your unconscious, written in the language of emotion, delivered through the medium of relationship. And the letter always says the same thing. Here is what you haven't seen. Here is what you haven't healed. Here is what you're still avoiding. Here is where you're still hiding. You can spend your whole life shooting the messenger. You can blame them, resent them, obsess over them, tell the story of how they wronged you. Or you can finally open the letter. You can finally read what it says. You can finally learn what it came to teach. Jung said that one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. And in love, that darkness is not your enemy. It's your teacher. It's the part of you that's been waiting, sometimes for decades, to be seen. It's the part of you that's been crying out for attention, not from another person, but from yourself. So here's the question that remains. Not who will love you, not when will they come, not why hasn't it happened yet, but this. Are you ready to see what the mirror has been showing you all along? Because when you finally turn and face yourself with the same intensity you've been directing outward, everything changes. The patterns break, the repetitions stop, the old story ends, and in its place, something new begins. Not a love story written by your wounds, but a love story written by your awareness. Not a search for someone to complete you, but a quiet, steady, unshakable knowing that you were never incomplete. You were just looking in the wrong direction. Thank you for staying with this exploration until the end. If something here resonated, if a door opened even a crack, then the work has begun. And that work, the work of turning inward, of facing yourself, of reclaiming your projections, is the most important work you will ever do. Not for love, not for a relationship, but for you, because you are the one you've been seeking. You always have been.